So now we're going to move on to our second and third line of defense. When you hear the term immunology, it's basically kind of referring to the second and third line of defense. These are much more sophisticated systems that are in place. Remember, our first line of defense is kind of just our physical barriers that are present. So our second and third line of defense is responsible for circulating through our body, finding anything that is foreign, identifying what it is, make sure it is foreign, not part of our body, and getting rid of it or destroying it. Now, before we go into our second line of defense, we need to kind of know who the cast of characters are. Because our immune system uses a variety of cells and tissues and organs from many different body systems, and interconnected network system that it uses. All right, so we want to first kind of step back and talk about some of these systems first. And we'll start out with the lymphatic system. All right, because our immune system is dependent upon our lymphatic system. So our lymphatic system is basically a collection of tissues and organs that are responsible for collecting, helping to circulate and filter fluid in body tissues, and then returning that fluid to our bloodstream. So some of our blood is delivered to our tissues. The plasma exits through the capillaries and seeps into the small spaces in between the cells in the tissue. And at that point, we kind of rename it and we say that it is interstitial fluid. Interstitial meaning kind of in between the cells. So the cells of the tissue are constantly being bathed in this water-based fluid that's rich in protein, but also leukocytes. So the lymphatic capillaries, which tend to run parallel to our blood capillaries, then take up the interstitial fluid and return it to our blood. And once the interstitial fluid enters our lymphatic vessels, we then call it lymph. So the lymphatic vessels then transport the lymph to the lymph nodes, where it's screened for pathogens and filtered. And then from there, the fluid is eventually channeled back into the veins, where it rejoins the blood plasma. Now, lymphoid tissue includes the thymus and bone marrow. These two have roles in being areas where leukocytes tend to mature, where they complete their development within these areas. The thymus is, they always say it's a butterfly-shaped organ that's near the heart. And both the bone marrow and the thymus make leukocytes, and they help them to mature before they enter into circulation in the body. So this is basically where your B cells and your T cells mature, and we'll kind of talk about them more later on. And throughout the body, we have lymph nodes that are clustered in 6 main areas around the body. So they're typically clustered in the neck, the underarms, the groin area is where you see a lot of the lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes are basically these small kind of bean-shaped organs that serve to filter the lymph. And they're basically screening centers for the lymph. So they want to screen it of whatever might be in that fluid before it's returned to the bloodstream. And whenever it detects the leukocytes that live in the lymph nodes rapidly tend to multiply. So whenever a pathogen is present, the leukocytes start to divide quickly. They want to expand their population so that they can combat that pathogen. So when you have this kind of abundant cell division, it causes these very small nodes to all suddenly become swollen and very tender to the touch. And that's because of that detection of a pathogen and the leukocytes expanding. So it filters the lymph before it's returned to the bloodstream, and that's useful because once again, it's helping to pull these pathogens out so before they gain access to the entire body through the bloodstream. We also have the spleen. So the spleen is a lymphoid organ. It's located in the upper left part of the abdomen, just under the diaphragm. And like lymph nodes, the spleen is a place where leukocytes look for invaders. But unlike the lymph nodes, the spleen is filtering blood. It doesn't filter lymph. Now, many areas of the body have bundles of lymphocytes that are just below the skin or are in contact with mucosal membranes. So these areas where we have these bundles, we give them kind of specialized name. So we can call them MALT or mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So this is lymphoid tissue is in the mucosal membranes, and that's where a majority of the lymphoid tissue is found. Or they can be called, given different names based upon the location in the body where they are found. So we've got SALT, which refers to skin-associated lymphoid tissue, or GALT, which refers to gut-associated lymphoid tissue. So these are referring to different areas in the body where we find this lymphoid tissue, these kind of congregations or bundles of lymphocytes. So they play a key role in finding and fighting microbes. And there's a bunch of different types of leukocytes that tend to patrol these different tissues, the MALT and the GALT and the SALT. So let's talk about these leukocytes. I've been mentioning them, all right? So the leukocytes are white blood cells, right? So our blood consists of different types of cells, and white blood cells are one of them. And there's a wide variety of different types of white blood cells, and they can be classified as either granulocytes or agranulocytes. So over here we have our granulocytes, and here's our agranulocytes. So granulocytes are cells with granules in their cytoplasm, and they are visible when different stains are used and they're viewed under a microscope. So their name is due to these granules that are present that you be using different staining techniques. And some of these cells can actually kind of explode and use their granules as a means of killing other cells. The agranulocytes, you see the monocyte here, and the monocyte can develop into macrophages or dendritic cells. So the agranulocytes do not have granules at all, but they still have very important roles in activating other leukocytes, part of our innate immune response. So we also have our lymphocytes, our B cells, our T cells, and our natural killer cells, and we'll kind of get into what the function of all these different types of cells do as we get into the second and third line of defenses. But just so you kind of get an idea that we're talking about all different types of leukocytes or white blood cells, and we kind of define whether they're granulocytes or agranulocytes. A lot of these have different, are capable of phagocytosis, all right? Once again, we'll kind of get into their roles. Now, when an infection occurs, both granulocytes and your agranulocytes, like the monocytes, they'll migrate to the infected area. And during this migration, the monocytes tend to enlarge and they develop into active phagocytic macrophages. And these cells then leave the blood and they migrate to the tissue to develop into these macrophages. And some macrophages can be what we call fixed macrophages. They are residents in certain tissues and organs of the body, such as the liver and the lungs and the brain, and they just kind of hang out there and stay there. Other macrophages are motile and are free, kind of wandering around macrophages, and they roam the tissues and gather at sites of infection or inflammation. So the various macrophages of the body constitute what we call the mononuclear phagocytic system. So it's called the mononuclear phagocytic system. All right. So, and this system, a lot of times, it's found in the thymus, your lymph nodes, your spleen, the membranes of your stomach. So they can be the fixed macrophages, or they can be kind of the wandering ones, but they're all kind of surveying different areas of their body, and they're on the watch for different pathogens around. So they're kind of, as it shows here, kind of wandering in between the cells, kind of little pathogens. Then we also have, and something else we need to kind of talk about before we get into the second line of defense, are cytokines. So cytokines are very small proteins, and they're used to convey information. And there's hundreds of different types of cytokines, so we're kind of using that term as a chemical group. And they're very important in just about every biological process that goes on inside you, but they're extremely relevant to your immune system. So let's say one of these macrophages happens to stumble across an enemy. And so that discovery then needs to be shared with other immune cells. So that macrophage is going to release cytokines that carry the information. Hey, there's danger, there's an enemy around, come on, help me out here. And so that macrophage is going to release the cytokines, and these cytokines are then going to float away from that area in your bodily fluids. And somewhere else, another immune cell is going to kind of smell, in a sense, these cytokines and receive the information. And the more cytokines that it picks up, the stronger the reaction it's going to have to them. So cells will use cytokines basically as a chemical trail. So the closer to the origin of the cytokines, the more cytokines it will be able to pick up. So by measuring the concentration of cytokines in the space around it, it can kind of precisely locate where the message is coming from and then begin in that direction. So it's going to move in the direction where there's a greater concentration of those cytokines. So cytokines are these, as it says, kind of these chemical secreted by the cells of our immune system to help relay information about what's going on in different parts of the body. Now there's lots of different groups of cytokines. So here we're introducing 4 classes that are the pro-inflammatory. So we want to cause an inflammatory response. Anti-inflammatory, we don't want the inflammatory response anymore. Vasoactive, where we want to constrict or dilate blood vessels, and ones that are involved in growth factors, helping to regulate the production of our lymphocytes. People from your book that talks about these different groups, and so you'll hear some of these names as we go on, especially serotonin and histamine, are vasoconstrictors and vasodilators, just so you know that these are types of cytokines. Leukins are also types of cytokines.